Hi everybody and welcome to Fauxropter, the podcast about refocused curiosity. I'm John Dutton and I'm here with...
Bobby Gaucher.
My lovely co-host.
Thank you for calling me lovely, that's very nice.
And a co-host.
Oh, well that's obvious. How would you get along without me? Wouldn't you be lonely?
Oh, that's a great segue. Wow.
I know, I'm a good co-host.
You just thought that up right there, didn't you? On the spot.
Not allowed to do any research, am I?
So, we did a lot of research for this one. Actually, in a way we did. Our episode today is about the word loneliness. And it was kind of inspired by an interview that the fantastic Ezra Klein did with the also fantastic Anne Applebaum for the New York Times. And it provoked a few thoughts and mini discussions. And then we said, let's do them out loud in podcast form, didn't we?
And share with our friends.
Exactly, which is you people listening right now.
Yeah, you people.
Yeah, not family, friends.
Yeah, be very clear about that.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully this gives you a little bit of insight and makes you feel a little bit less lonely. Well, John, I'll let you kick this one off, as you sent me the podcast that I had to listen to at work.
And we won't tell anybody that you did that. Whoops, this is being recorded.
Oh no, I listen to podcasts all day at work. Everybody knows.
So what inspired this choice of word, as I already mentioned in the intro, was Ezra Klein's interview with Anne Applebaum for the New York Times about Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And in that book, which I have not read to my shame, she talks about loneliness as being one of the causes of kind of disconnection from society that allows authoritarian, totalitarian leaders to take over.
So that brings us to talking about the root of loneliness and what loneliness means to us.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead then, Bobby.
So I thought a lot about this. It wasn't a very, fun thing to sit with while you're alone listening to podcasts.
So you were alone listening to podcasts about loneliness, thinking about loneliness.
Isolated in my office with headphones on.
And that's not fun.
Oh, I loved it. But I think it's, if somebody were to be looking in, they'd be like, yeah, that lady's real alone. I think loneliness is very interesting, and I think it ties well with vulnerability. Because I think feeling isolated is one thing, but feeling isolated and vulnerable is what loneliness would mean to me.
That's interesting.
And being able to not communicate it with anybody, that's, I think, is where the shuddering loneliness comes from, is you just become further and further isolated and you can't reach out.
And that is especially interesting to me because that's an extra alternative perspective to the thing that Anne Applebaum was talking about in that interview, which was that loneliness was about a disconnection from a kind of shared narrative, but you're talking more about a real vulnerability that you feel like.
But I think that vulnerability comes from not being part of a narrative. So a good example is FOMO, fear of missing out. Mm-hmm. So it's when your friends are going out and you are not going. If you tell your friends, I have a fear of missing out, I'm sad I won't be there, you don't become lonely because you still have a connection to them. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you let that kind of isolation and distance grow and you don't communicate it with anybody, you feel like you can't, and then you end up sad and alone. And then a thing that we've seen recently since the rise of social media especially is, what do people do when they're all alone? They go online and then they find other people who are lonely, and then they are in fact vulnerable to being convinced that certain things are true that might not be true, let's just say. Or being convinced that certain people are true and they're not true.
Mm-hmm. They listen to people who give them a new narrative, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Which I hope that not all the time it's a bad thing. There are a bunch of communities, especially online communities, that are helpful to people. But I think being vulnerable in real life, or as you would say, IRL, is kind of a more tangible thing. And when you take your loneliness to the internet, it opens you up for so much more loneliness. B, just, it's so frightening. what you can do. Like, you're so vulnerable when you're lonely that if you go online searching for some sort of connection, yes, you may find it, but now you're also like tethered to it. Whereas if you reach out to a friend in real life or call somebody, you have that instant connection and you feel a little bit better about it, and you don't feel as taken over by it.
So you're saying that there's an actual qualitative difference between in real life connection with people and people that were strangers online that you feel a connection with, and people do join these groups. Mm-hmm. The ultimate one, of course, is QAnon, right? That has got pretty much out of hand in terms of influence in societies around the world. But that you're saying there's a genuine qualitative difference. It's not like the number of friends you have. It could be God knows how many people are in QAnon. Mm-hmm. But that reaching out to even one friend who is actually a real friend, there's something different about that.
No, I would say the mode of communication is different. Because if you think about, when you get into a texting conversation with someone, you feel like you can't leave your phone and do anything else. Mm-hmm. It was that good of a texting, it could be anything. Mm-hmm. That you sit there and you stay on your phone. Or in the late 90s and early 2000s, you would get into an AOL chat and just stay on your computer until God knows what hour. And I think that kind of disassociation is what's unhealthy.
So you're saying actually the qualitative difference is more about the tech. It's about the device and the channel or whatever.
Because I think everybody can admit that if you stare at your phone or a computer screen for too long, you do feel lonely once you take your face away from that screen.
And how does that relate? You're a person who watches a tiny bit more TV than me, for example, right?
I watch an astounding amount of TV, and I'm very proud of it.
You're a champ.
When I took down notes for what made me feel lonely with my phone and what made me feel not alone was television.
So that's what I was going to ask, because I don't think you are a particularly lonely person. You have tons and tons of friends and stuff, and you do have family that you live nearby and see all the time and talk to all the time.
So I don't think either of those things have to do with being lonely.
Right. So I'd like to know the answer to that afterwards. Mm-hmm. But the first question is, what is the difference therefore between TV? Because it would logically, you'd think, well, if you're on some online forum or something, you're discussing with people and you're all like, oh my God, there's this thing, and you're egging each other on. You would think that logically that would be less lonely than just staring at a TV that never talks back to you. You
would think that. However, my rationale, which is my own, and it's how I feel about it. Whenever I watch TV or movies, there's two types of things I would go to. I'm either going to something that's actually of quality, or I'm watching very garbage or trashy TV. Mm-hmm. Trashy TV, I would probably watch when I'm lonely, just because it's easy to consume and I don't need to be thinking and I can zone out. Whereas the other one, whenever I watch something of quality, it makes me feel less lonely because I know A, there's people with the same sense of humor as me. B, they're brilliant and they can write genius jokes or very heartfelt storylines. And C, it makes me want to write. As soon as I watch something that's of quality and well written, I'm oh, this is brilliant, they're great at writing, I'm going to go write.
It inspires you.
Mm-hmm. I guess it does.
But the trashy type of TV...
That makes me feel lonely.
It's more of a sort of displacement, a distraction type thing, right? So that's almost the same as any other activity that people could do, like exercise or something, whatever to just distract themselves, or drinking or something, right? So that's actually, there's a big, big difference between that and going onto an online discussion group or forum or something.
Well, I think drinking, exercising, or watching crappy TV, at least it's only a one-way thing. Whereas as soon as you enter a forum, the two-way thing, I think the word tether is perfect for it, because it's almost like it's seeping into you and it becomes part of you. You can't latch off of it. Mm-hmm.
This is very interesting, because it seems to go counter to what I would have assumed already. You would assume that it's a good thing to find community online. And you did mention that there are lots of healthy ways of doing that online. And of course, it's absolutely true. And I remember the beginning of the internet. One of the great things about it was that people who are marginalized in society, who had trouble, sometimes because whatever they were marginalized for was illegal or something, could find people similar to them online and re-find a community that they couldn't have in real life, actually. So that was great.
That's great.
Right.
And it does exist. I'm not shaming the internet for producing only evil.
No, I know, exactly. But that was one of the reasons that was such a good thing. It was that people who, it wasn't just a pure loneliness thing. It was to do with people whose identities were somehow seen as being, a threat to society somehow. So they're outside of regular society, and therefore it's not just a personal loneliness thing. It's to do with a group identity thing, I guess.
Which gets back into like the idea of loneliness is not being part of a narrative. The World Wide Web opened that community up for people, and it allowed people to access a narrative. But it also is lawless. And it's lawless in a very concerning way. Like, there are just basic rules that human beings follow, regardless of, like, actual governments or rules. Like, be good to each other.
Like
be
a social contract.
Yeah. And the internet has removed social contract. It allows people to go in any which direction they want. And it allows those people who are marginalized and lonely and vulnerable to interact with people who take advantage of those things.
This relates back a bit to our episode about the word cancel and cancel culture and stuff like that. But it's not quite, but now we're talking about people who are, have opposing views on something, right? Like, you people shouldn't be allowed to, whatever. Okay. But
anytime someone starts a sentence with you people, it's probably going in a bad direction.
Exactly. But the example of QAnon, for example, or whatever group that is based upon, an unreal narrative, let's just say, to be generous, those people aren't arguing with each other. They're all like playing this wonderful fantasy game together to find out the next answer to the puzzle that explains how the world is all against them. I'm just like oversimplifying from what I understand. But that's what's weird about that is there is a tether there, like to use your term, which I think is a great term, but it doesn't have that negative on the face of it aspect.
Yeah. I don't think it has to be negative. I think positive reinforcement is a better communicator and a better solidifier than negativity. Like, to feel part of a community and to feel like you're no longer alone, you would have to have positive reinforcement.
And this, if I'm now thinking about it clearly, comes back around to Hannah Arendt's definition, because it makes me wonder, because does it therefore mean that something like QAnon would not help totalitarian leader take over because people would have less loneliness? If she says that loneliness produces the conditions for totalitarianism, if QAnon makes people less lonely, maybe it's not such a bad thing in terms of because a lot of people think it's the opposite, that QAnon is going to definitely lead to authoritarianism and totalitarianism.
Oh, I don't think so. I think, like, you can argue that it's being misinformed, but there is at least some thought to having information. I think education is the most powerful tool on the planet. So, arguably, you're right. And if you feel connected to another group of people and you're constantly in conversation, even if that conversation might be phony baloney, at least you're in constant communication. Whereas somebody who's completely isolated, I think, would lead closer to totalitarianism. And
maybe that relates back to what Ezra Klein and Applebaum brought up in that interview, which was like white supremacists, like, let's just say isolated, lonely young white males, then get a feeling of,
acceptance and community.
Community, exactly. So a sort of cure for their loneliness by doing their weapons training together
and showing up for meetings and being disgusting. I have thought of a really interesting example for loneliness. And I think it's a very good comparison. It's a real life comparison to how the internet might make us feel lonely. I think abusive relationships are a very good indicator of how isolating it feels to be lonely when you're surrounded by people. Because, for instance, like, there's plenty of very, very smart people who end up in abusive relationships. And I think the general and first response is that, well, why wouldn't you just leave? But you always have positive reinforcement after a negative event. And then you feel like you can't communicate with anyone else. So you end up stuck in this very small hole that makes you feel very small and you can't leave. And I think it's important to note that loneliness is a big part of those relationships And it's a big indicator of why people can't actually exit them.
That's sad and interesting. Well, this hasn't been the most fun episode of Fauxropter ever, has it?
I had a great time.
Oh, good. Good. Just so everybody knows, I'll be smiling right now.
Don't tell people that.
I think this is an important thing to be conscious of, right? Loneliness. That sounds completely obvious. Mm-hmm. No, almost nobody's going to say, yeah, loneliness doesn't matter. Loneliness is obviously an important thing. If Hannah Arendt brought it up decades ago as having super negative consequences beyond just individuals, it's definitely something to be talked about, and that's why Ezra Klein and Applebaum were talking about it. But I think that there's a little bit more to it even than that, like the stuff that we've just touched on.
Mm-hmm. And I think, just as a good end note, everybody feels lonely. Mm-hmm. It feels isolating to feel lonely, but every single person feels lonely at one point or another. Yeah,
and I suppose, in a way, an acceptance of that would be actually quite a good thing. Because if you say to yourself, well, I'm feeling lonely right now, therefore I'm a loser or I'm worthless or something like that, you add a negative personal value judgment, then that's really dangerous, right?
I think that's where the danger of loneliness comes from, is exactly what you described. And I think the vulnerability of having that feeling and that negativeness towards yourself, even if you just reach out to somebody and say, hey, how's it going? You don't have to say, hey, I feel lonely.
Yeah. And very sadly, the word lone is used for lone, gunmen and people who commit terrible crimes. The word loneliness is right in there, and so it's certainly a thing that people should be thinking a bit more about and maybe doing more about.
Reach out to your friends. Or reach out to us.
Yes. If you want to reach out to us, you can email us at fauxropter@gmail.com. If you don't know how to spell Fauxropter, well, it's in the...
You found it somehow.
You found it somehow, and it's in the show notes and everything, the link to the email. So,
and also, always feel free to reach out with words that you would like us to discuss.
Yes. There's only so many words that we can possibly think of. So, please...
Tell us more words. John's right. We only know about 14 so far.
I know. It's like, 20. That's the limit.
We're going to have so many seasons, but just in case.
Yeah, I'm getting word insecurity.
Well, don't feel alone.
All right. Take care, everybody. We will be talking to you soon.
See you later.